Some wounds run so deep they pass from father to son like a family curse. For 68 years, Cash McGraw carried the shame of a great-grandfather who abandoned his family and never came home from war. Now this wealthy Texas rancher stood before the crumbling estate his ancestor left behind in 1898. The locals said the place was cursed. 3 generations of McGraws had stayed away from Black Hollow, but Cash was different. He had made millions in oil and cattle, and he came here looking for answers. The house sat empty for over a century, its secrets locked away in rotting walls and broken windows. Cash figured his money could restore the old place and maybe give him some peace about his family name. He hired workers to fix it up, room by room. But what happens when you discover everything you believed about your family was a lie? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rusted iron gate groaned as Cash McGraw pushed it open, its hinges protesting after decades of neglect. The McGraw family crest, a lone star beneath crossed cattle brands, was barely visible through layers of rust and decay. Cash ran his weathered fingers over the metal, feeling the weight of history in every corroded edge. This gate had once welcomed carriages and horses, visitors coming to pay respects to one of East Texas's most prosperous ranching families. Now, it stood as a monument to abandonment. Cash pulled his silver Silverado through the gate and up the winding gravel drive. Mesquite and oak had grown wild along the path, their branches scraping against his truck like skeletal fingers trying to turn him away. But Cash McGraw hadn't built an empire in oil and cattle by backing down from a fight, even one with his own ghosts. At 68, Cash cut an imposing figure. Silver hair swept back from a face carved by decades of Texas sun and wind, deep lines around grey eyes that had seen fortunes made and lost. His hands, thick and calloused despite his wealth, gripped the steering wheel with the same intensity he'd once used to break wild horses. Those same hands had signed deals worth millions, but today they trembled slightly as the house came into view. The McGraw estate rose from the pine-choked landscape like something from a fever dream. 3 stories of Victorian excess, all turrets and gables, wraparound porches and bay windows. Once painted a pristine white with forest green trim, it now stood grey and weathered, paint peeling in long strips that fluttered in the East Texas breeze like old skin. Broken shutters hung at odd angles, and several windows on the upper floors had been boarded over with rotting plywood. Cash parked near the front steps and climbed out, his boots crunching on gravel mixed with fallen leaves and debris. The silence was complete, except for the wind through the pines and the distant call of a mockingbird. He'd expected to feel many things standing here: anger, sadness, maybe even fear. What he hadn't expected was the profound loneliness that settled over him like a heavy coat. His great-grandfather, Jeremiah McGraw, had built this house in 1895 with money from the largest cattle operation in 3 counties. By all accounts, Jeremiah had been a man of vision and ambition, someone who understood that Texas was changing and positioned himself to profit from that change. The house was meant to be the crown jewel of the McGraw legacy, a symbol of permanence and prosperity. Instead, it became a tomb. Cash pulled out his phone and called Jake Sullivan, the contractor he'd hired out of nearby Marshall. Jake had worked on several of Cash's properties over the years, a straight-talking man in his 50s who knew how to restore old buildings without destroying their character. More importantly, he was one of the few contractors willing to work on the McGraw place. "Jake, I'm here," Cash said when Sullivan picked up. "How soon can you get your crew out?" "Already loaded up and heading your way, Mr. McGraw." Jake's voice crackled through the phone. "Should be there in about 20 minutes. You sure about this? I mean, really sure?" Cash had asked himself that question during the entire 3-hour drive from his ranch outside Dallas. Was he sure? Hell no. But he was committed. "I'm sure, Jake. This place has sat empty long enough." After hanging up, Cash walked to the front porch. The wooden steps sagged under his weight, but held. Double doors of solid oak, their brass hardware green with verdigris, stood slightly ajar. Cash pushed one open and stepped inside. The smell hit him first, a musty combination of dust, mold, and something else he couldn't identify. Old wood and older secrets, maybe. Sunlight filtered through grimy windows, creating shafts of gold that illuminated floating dust motes and revealed the house's bones. The entry hall stretched before him, a grand staircase curving upward to the second floor. Faded wallpaper depicted pastoral scenes, shepherds and sheep, in a landscape that had probably been cheerful once, but now looked ghostly in the dim light. A crystal chandelier hung askew, several of its arms broken, casting fractured rainbows on the wall. Cash moved through the downstairs rooms methodically. The parlour still held furniture draped in white sheets, like mourners at a funeral that had lasted over a century. In the dining room, a massive oak table sat beneath more dusty cloth, surrounded by chairs that would never again host family gatherings. The kitchen, primitive even by 1898 standards, felt like stepping into a museum of domestic life. Everything was exactly as Jeremiah had left it. According to the family stories Cash had heard growing up, his great-grandfather had simply walked out one day in March of 1898, claiming he was going to fight in the Spanish-American War. He'd promised to return by Christmas. That Christmas came and went, then another and another. Jeremiah McGraw was never seen again. The family fell apart without him. His wife, Constance, moved back to her family in Louisiana with their 2 young sons, including Cash's grandfather. The estate was closed up, taxes paid through a trust that somehow kept running for over a century. 3 generations of McGraws had grown up with the story of the ancestor who abandoned his family for war and glory, leaving behind nothing but shame and empty rooms. Cash had believed that story his entire life. It had shaped his understanding of what it meant to be a McGraw, that beneath all their success and respectability lay a core of weakness and abandonment. His father had been a hard man, quick with a belt and slow with praise, as if he were trying to beat the McGraw cowardice out of his sons before it could take root. Cash had spent his whole adult life proving he wasn't like Jeremiah, building an empire that no one could abandon because it was built on his own sweat and will. But now, standing in Jeremiah's house, Cash felt something shifting in his understanding. Maybe it was the way the light fell across the dining room table, or how the family portrait still hung on the walls, but this didn't feel like the home of a man who would abandon his family. Everything here spoke of permanence, of someone who had built something meant to last generations. The sound of trucks in the driveway pulled Cash from his thoughts. Through the window, he watched Jake Sullivan's crew unload equipment. Jake himself climbed the front steps with the careful tread of a man who respected old houses and their moods. "Lord, have mercy," Jake said as he stepped inside. "This place is a time capsule." Jake Sullivan looked like what Central Casting would order if they needed a Texas contractor, lean and weathered, work boots permanently stained with everything from concrete to coffee. His crew followed him in. Miguel Santos, a master carpenter who could make old wood sing. Tommy Chen, an electrician who specialized in historic properties. And Dale Murphy, a plumber who'd learned his trade from his grandfather. "What's the plan, boss?" Jake asked, setting down his clipboard and looking around the entry hall. "Make it livable again," Cash said. "I want to understand this place, and I can't do that from a hotel room in Marshall. I'll be staying here during the renovation." Jake raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. He'd worked for enough wealthy eccentrics to know when not to ask questions. "We'll need to start with basics, electricity, plumbing, structural assessment. This old girl's been sitting empty for a long time, and that's hard on a house." "Whatever it takes," Cash said. "Money's not an object. But I want it done right, restored, not renovated. I want to understand how Jeremiah lived here." "Yes, sir. We'll treat her with respect." Jake made notes on his clipboard. "Miguel, start with the structural stuff. Tommy, see what's left of the electrical. Dale, Let's pray the plumbing is better than it looks. I'll work with Mr. McGraw on a timeline. As the crew spread out through the house, Cash found himself drawn back to the family portraits in the parlor. Jeremiah stared down at him from an oil painting above the mantelpiece, a man in his 30s with dark hair and serious eyes, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people made in a year. Next to him, a smaller portrait showed Constance, a delicate woman with sad eyes and brown hair pinned up in the fashion of the time. But it was the photograph on the side table that stopped Cash cold. A tintype showing Jeremiah in military uniform, but not the blue of Union forces or the grey of the Confederacy. This was a different uniform entirely, with brass buttons and a high collar that Cash didn't recognize. Jeremiah stood at attention, his hand resting on the pommel of a cavalry saber, his expression serious but not unhappy. Cash picked up the photograph, studying his great-grandfather's face. There was something in those eyes, a sadness maybe, or a weight that suggested this man carried burdens beyond his years. This wasn't the face of someone eager to abandon his family for the adventure of war. This was the face of a man who understood sacrifice. "Mr. McGraw," Jake's voice called from the kitchen, "you might want to see this." Cash set the photograph down and followed Jake's voice. In the kitchen, Tommy Chen was standing near the pantry, his electrical tester in hand. "Power's been off for decades," Tommy said, "but look at this." He pointed to a section of the pantry wall where the wood looked different from the rest, newer, somehow, despite the overall age of the house. "Renovation work?" Cash asked. "Maybe," Jake said, running his hands along the wood. "But it's good work, professional, like someone sealed something up and wanted it to stay sealed." He looked at Cash. "You want us to open it up?" Cash hesitated. Something in the way Jake phrased the question, "wanted it to stay sealed," sent a chill through him. But he'd come here for answers, not to honor old secrets. "Open it up," he said, "but carefully. If there's something back there, I want to know what it is." As Jake and Miguel began examining the wall more closely, Cash wandered back to the parlor and the tintype of Jeremiah. The afternoon light was starting to fade, casting long shadows across the room. Somewhere in the walls, he could hear the crew working the sounds of hammers and saws, beginning the long process of bringing the house back to life. But as Cash stood there looking at his great-grandfather's photograph, he couldn't shake the feeling that some secrets were buried for good reason, and that opening up old walls might reveal more than just empty spaces. The house creaked around him as wind picked up outside, and for just a moment, Cash McGraw wondered if the locals were right about the curse on this place. Not a supernatural curse, maybe, but the curse of carrying lies for so long that the truth became too dangerous to face. He was about to find out. 3 days into the renovation, Cash was beginning to think Jake's crew could work miracles. The electricity was flowing again, the plumbing grudgingly functional, and the house had started to feel less like a tomb and more like a home that had simply been sleeping. But it was on the morning of the 4th day that everything changed. Cash was examining a loose floorboard in what had been Jeremiah's study when his boot caught on something that didn't belong. He knelt down and pried at the board with a pocket knife, feeling it give way with a soft crack. Underneath, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow survived over a century, was a brass key unlike any he'd ever seen. The key was ornate, almost decorative, with an intricate head shaped like a star, not unlike the one on the McGraw family crest. The brass had darkened with age, but showed no signs of corrosion. Someone had cared for this key, protected it, hidden it with purpose. Cash turned it over in his palm, feeling its weight. Heavy, substantial, made to open something important. "Find something interesting?" Jake appeared in the doorway, coffee mug in hand. "Maybe," Cash said, showing him the key. "You seen anything around here this might fit?" Jake studied the key, whistling low. "That's fancy work. Custom made, I'd guess. And old, real old." He handed it back to Cash. "Could be for a strongbox. Maybe a chest." Wealthy folks back then often had secure storage for valuables. Cash pocketed the key and spent the next hour methodically searching every room on the first floor. No strongbox, no chest, no obvious lock that matched the key's distinctive shape. The mystery gnawed at him as he moved through the house, examining furniture, checking drawers, looking for anything the key might open. It was Miguel who provided the first clue. "Senor McGraw," he called from the second-floor landing. "This wall, it sounds different." Cash climbed the stairs to find Miguel, tapping along the hallway wall with his knuckles. Most of the wall produced a solid thunk, but one section, about 4 feet wide, echoed hollow. "Hidden space?" Cash asked. "See, common in old houses, sometimes for storage, sometimes for—" Miguel paused, choosing his words carefully. "For hiding things." They were joined by Jake, who brought his stud finder and ran it along the wall. "Miguel's right. There's definitely a void back here. Question is, how do we get into it?" Cash was studying the wallpaper pattern when he noticed a slight irregularity in the design, about 6 feet from the floor. When he pressed on it, he felt something give slightly, like a hidden catch, but it was locked. "Jake," Cash said, pulling out the brass key. "What do you think?" Jake examined the wallpaper more closely and found what they were looking for, a tiny keyhole, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. It was positioned at the center of a decorative rose in the wallpaper pattern, hidden in plain sight. Cash inserted the key. It fit perfectly. The mechanism was still smooth after all these years, well-oiled and carefully maintained. With a soft click, a section of the wall swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow staircase leading up into darkness. "Well, I'll be damned," Jake muttered. Cash pulled out his phone's flashlight and shone it up the stairs. The steps were wooden, solid, leading up to what appeared to be a landing. "Third floor," he said, "but from outside this house only looks like 2 stories. "Hidden 3rd floor," Jake agreed. "Someone went to a lot of trouble to keep this secret." Before they could explore further, a voice called up from the 1st floor. "Hello? Anyone home?" Cash closed the hidden door and pocketed the key. "Up here," he called back. The woman who climbed the stairs was in her 70s, grey-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing a simple dress and comfortable shoes. She moved with the careful precision of someone who'd lived through enough of life to know when to be cautious. "You must be Cash McGraw," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Martha Hayes. I run the local historical society, and I heard you were renovating the old place." "News travels fast in Black Hollow," Cash said, shaking her hand. Martha's smile was polite but strained. "Fast enough. I was hoping we could have a talk, Mr. McGraw, about the house, about your family's history here." They went downstairs to the parlor, where Martha accepted a cup of coffee from the pot. Jake kept going. She settled into one of the old chairs Cash had uncovered, looking around the room with an expression that was hard to read. "I've lived in Black Hollow my entire life," Martha began. 73 years. My grandmother lived here before me, and her grandmother before her. That's a lot of history, Mr. McGraw, a lot of stories passed down through the generations." "I'd like to hear them," Cash said. "I don't know much about my great-grandfather beyond the basic facts." Martha's expression grew more serious. "That's what I was afraid of. Mr. McGraw, there are things about your family's time here that aren't in any history books, things that people stopped talking about officially but never forgot." She paused, seeming to wrestle with how much to say. "Your great-grandfather didn't leave for the Spanish-American War, Mr. McGraw. That was the story the family told, but it wasn't the truth. Jeremiah McGraw left Black Hollow because he had to leave, because staying would have meant—" She trailed off. "Would have meant what?" "Would have meant dying," Martha said quietly. "There are some folks in town who still remember the stories their grandparents told, about why no McGraw has lived in this house for over a century, about why some folks think this place should have been torn down decades ago." Cash felt a chill that had nothing to do with the old house's drafts. "What kind of stories?" Martha stood up, setting down her coffee cup with shaking hands. The kind that are better left buried, Mr. McGraw. The kind that don't bring peace to anyone who digs them up. She looked directly at him. I'm not here to threaten you, but I am here to warn you. There are people in Black Hollow who won't be happy to see the McGraw name back in this house. People who think some secrets should stay secret. And you? Cash asked. What do you think? Martha was quiet for a long moment. I think every family has a right to know the truth about their history, but I also think some truths come with a price. She moved toward the door. If you decide you want to hear the real story about Jeremiah McGraw, you can find me at the Historical Society. But think carefully before you ask, Mr. McGraw. Once you know, you can't unknow. After Martha left, Cash sat alone in the parlor, the brass key heavy in his pocket. Jake's crew worked around him, the sounds of renovation continuing, but his mind was focused on the hidden staircase and Martha Hayes's warning. Whatever was up in that sealed room, it was connected to the real reason Jeremiah had left, not for war and glory, but running from something that had made staying impossible. Something that people in Black Hollow still remembered, still feared enough to want kept buried. Cash pulled out the key and studied it again. Such a small thing to hold such weight. But as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the parlor floor, he made his decision. He'd come here for the truth about his family, and he wasn't leaving without it. That evening, after Jake's crew had gone home, Cash stood alone at the bottom of the hidden staircase. He'd told Jake about Martha's visit, but not about his intention to explore the secret room. Some things, he'd decided, a man had to face alone. The brass key turned easily in the hidden lock. The door swung open on silent hinges, and Cash began climbing the narrow stairs toward whatever truth Jeremiah McGraw had sealed away over a century ago. The hidden staircase was steeper than it looked, each step groaning softly under Cash's weight despite their solid construction. His phone's flashlight carved a narrow path through the darkness, revealing walls of unpainted wood and air thick with the dust of decades. At the top of the stairs, he found himself facing a heavy wooden door with brass fittings that matched the key in his hand. This lock was different from the one below, larger, more substantial, meant to keep secrets safe rather than simply hidden. Cash slid the key into the lock and turned. The mechanism was stiff but functional, and after a moment's resistance, he heard the heavy thunk of tumblers falling into place. The door opened into a room that took Cash's breath away. Unlike the rest of the house, this space had been hermetically sealed, preserved in a pocket of still air that felt almost sacred. The room was a study, but not like any Cash had ever seen. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, leather-bound volumes that spoke of serious learning and deep thought. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface clear, except for a single leather-bound journal placed precisely in the middle, as if waiting for someone to return and continue reading. Cash stepped inside, his flashlight revealing more details. A leather chair behind the desk, its burgundy hide still supple. A small table beside it, holding a pipe stand and tobacco pouch. On the wall, maps of Texas and the surrounding territories marked with red pins in locations Cash didn't recognize. And everywhere, the feeling that whoever had used this room had left intending to come back soon. The journal drew him like a magnet. Cash approached the desk slowly, almost reverently. The leather cover was dark brown, worn smooth by countless hands. When he opened it, the pages released a faint scent of old paper and ink. The writing inside was in a firm, masculine hand that reminded Cash of his own grandfather's letters. The first entry was dated March 15th, 1898. Asterisk. I find myself compelled to set down the truth of what has happened here, knowing full well that this record may be the only honest account that survives. The town tells one story, my family will be told another, but someone, someday, should know what really drove Jeremiah McGraw from the land of his fathers. Asterisk. Cash's hands trembled slightly as he turned the page. This was it, the real story. written in Jeremiah's own hand. Asterisk. I have lived my entire life believing that a man's worth was measured by his ability to protect what he loved. My cattle, my land, my family, these were the things that defined me. I never imagined that protecting what I loved most would require abandoning everything else. Asterisk. The journal entries continued, each one revealing more of the truth that had been buried for over a century. Jeremiah wrote with the precision of an educated man and the passion of someone desperate to be understood, even if only by future generations. Asterisk. Elena came into my life like spring water in a drought. I was not looking for love. I had a wife, 2 sons, responsibilities that stretched across 3 counties. But some forces in life cannot be denied, cannot be reasoned with or controlled. Elena was one of those forces. Asterisk. Cash read on, the journal revealing a love story that completely contradicted everything he'd been told about his great-grandfather. This wasn't the account of a man who abandoned his family for war and glory. This was the record of a man torn between 2 kinds of love, duty to the family he'd built and devotion to the woman who had captured his heart. Asterisk. She is Comanche, from the settlement by the river. In the eyes of this town, that makes our feelings for each other not just scandalous but dangerous. I have heard the talk, seen the looks when we speak in public. There are men here who would see her driven away, or worse, and who would destroy me for defending her. Asterisk. The implications hit Cash like a physical blow. His great-grandfather hadn't been a deserter or a coward. He'd been a man caught in an impossible situation, trying to protect someone he loved, in a time and place where such love was not just forbidden, but potentially fatal. The journal entries grew more urgent as the days passed. Asterisk. The threats are no longer subtle. Yesterday, I found 3 of my prize bulls dead in the north pasture, their throats cut clean. No rustler would do such work and leave the meat to rot. This was a message, as clear as if they'd written it in blood. End this, or we will end it for you. Asterisk. Cash sat back in the leather chair, the weight of understanding settling over him. Jeremiah hadn't abandoned his family. He'd tried to protect both his family and the woman he loved, caught between forces that made any good choice impossible. The door creaked behind him. Cash spun around, expecting to see Jake or one of the crew, but the doorway was empty. Just old house settling, he told himself, though something about the sound had felt deliberate, as if the house itself were responding to having its secrets finally exposed. He returned to the journal, turning pages carefully. The entries became shorter, more desperate. Asterisk. Elena begged me to take her and run, to leave everything and start fresh somewhere. The McGraw name means nothing, but how can a man abandon 2 sons? How can I let them grow up believing their father was a coward when the truth is I loved too much, not too little? Asterisk. The final entries were almost painful to read. Asterisk. I have made my choice. Elena will tell her people I have rejected her, that she means nothing to me. I will tell mine that I am going to war, that duty calls me away from personal concerns. Both stories are lies, but they are lies that will keep everyone alive. I pray that someday someone will find this record and understand that some sacrifices have nothing to do with courage and everything to do with love. Asterisk. Cash closed the journal, his throat tight with emotion. For 68 years, he'd carried shame about a great-grandfather who had supposedly abandoned his family. Now he understood that Jeremiah had made the hardest choice a man could make. He'd sacrificed his own happiness, his own reputation, even his family's understanding of him, to keep the people he loved safe. But there were still questions. What had happened to Elena? Had Jeremiah's sacrifice actually protected her, or had his departure simply delayed the inevitable? And what about the threats who had been behind them, and were their descendants the same people Martha Hayes had warned him about? Cash looked around the sealed room with new eyes. This wasn't just a study, it was a shrine to a love that had cost a man everything. Every book on these shelves, every careful arrangement of furniture, had been left exactly as Jeremiah wanted it, a testament to feelings that couldn't be spoken aloud, but couldn't be forgotten either. The leather-bound journal felt heavier in his hands now, weighted with the truth of a story that challenged everything Cash thought he knew about honor, duty, and sacrifice. His great-grandfather hadn't been weak. He'd been strong enough to bear shame he didn't deserve for the sake of protecting others. As Cash prepared to leave the hidden room, he noticed something else on the desk, a small depression in the wood, as if another object had rested there for years. Something that had been removed, perhaps taken when Jeremiah left, or maybe hidden elsewhere in this secret space. Whatever it was, Cash intended to find it. The journal had given him the beginning of the truth, but every instinct told him the story wasn't complete. Somewhere in this house, in this room, there were more pieces to the puzzle of what had really happened to Jeremiah McGraw and the woman he'd loved enough to sacrifice everything to protect. Cash spent the next morning searching every inch of the secret study, driven by an instinct that more secrets lay hidden in that preserved space. The depression in the desk proved to be more than decorative when he pressed on it just right. A hidden drawer slid open with the soft whisper of well-oiled wood. Inside, wrapped in faded silk that had once been white, was a silver locket on a delicate chain. The locket was beautiful workmanship, engraved with intricate patterns that looked Native American in design. But it was what Cash found inside that stopped his breath entirely. The tiny photograph showed a young woman with dark hair and striking features, high cheekbones, intelligent eyes, and a gentle smile that seemed to reach across more than a century. She was beautiful, but more than that, she radiated a quiet strength that explained how she'd captured the heart of a man like Jeremiah McGraw. This was Elena. But the locket held more than just her photograph. Tucked behind the picture was a small piece of birch bark with writing in 2 languages, English in Jeremiah's familiar hand, and what Cash assumed was Comanche in Elena's careful script. The English read simply, "Forever, regardless of distance or time." The Comanche writing remained a mystery, but the sentiment was clear. Cash sat in the leather chair, holding the locket in his palm and feeling the weight of a love story that had been hidden for over a century. The journal had told him about Elena, but the locket made her real, a flesh-and-blood woman who had loved his great-grandfather enough to risk everything, and who had been loved enough in return that Jeremiah had carried her image with him even as he prepared to leave everything behind. The sound of vehicles in the driveway pulled Cash from his reverie. He pocketed the locket and made his way downstairs, where Jake was already directing his crew to start work on the dining room restoration. "Find anything interesting in your midnight exploration?" Jake asked, with a knowing look. Cash had learned over the years that Jake Sullivan was one of those men who saw everything but spoke only when necessary. "You could say that. Jake, what do you know about the Comanche who used to live around here?" Jake paused in reviewing his work orders. "Not much personally, but my grandmother used to tell stories. Said there was a settlement by the river, maybe 5 miles east of here. Peaceful folks. Mostly they'd come into town to trade, kept to themselves. Otherwise." He looked at Cash carefully. "This about your great-grandfather?" "Maybe. You know anyone who might remember more?" "Martha Hayes would be your best bet, but given how she reacted yesterday..." Jake shrugged. "There's also the reservation about an hour north. Might be some folks there who kept the old stories alive." Before Cash could respond, another vehicle pulled into the driveway. Through the window, he watched a beat-up pickup truck park next to Jake's work van. The driver was a young man in his 20s with dark hair and the kind of lean build that came from physical work. But it was the passenger who caught Cash's attention, an elderly woman with silver-streaked black hair and features that reminded him immediately of the photograph in the locket. Jake noticed them too. "Well, that's interesting timing. That's Sarah Crowfeather and her grandson Thomas. They run a small ranch north of here." Cash's heart began beating faster. Crowfeather. Could this be Elena's family? The elderly woman approached the house with the measured dignity of someone accustomed to being treated with respect. Her grandson followed a step behind, his expression cautious but curious. She climbed the front steps and knocked firmly on the door frame. "Mr. McGraw?" Her voice carried the slight accent of someone for whom English was a second language, but her words were precise and clear. "I am Sarah Crow Feather. I believe we need to talk." Cash invited them into the parlor, the same room where Martha Hayes had delivered her warning the day before. But where Martha had seemed nervous and evasive, Sarah Crow Feather radiated calm certainty. She settled into the chair across from Cash, as if she belonged there. "My great-great-grandmother was named Elena," she said without preamble. "Elena Crow Feather. She lived by the river near here until 1898, when she disappeared. The story my family tells is that she fell in love with a white rancher who owned this house." Cash felt the locket in his pocket like a burning coal. "What happened to her?" "That depends on which story you believe," Sarah said. "The official story, the one the town tells, is that she ran off with some drifter and was never seen again. The story my family tells is different." She looked directly at Cash. "We say she died protecting the man she loved from people who couldn't accept their feelings for each other." Thomas spoke for the first time. "Grandmother, maybe we should—" Sarah raised a hand, silencing him gently. "Thomas thinks I'm too old to be stirring up ancient troubles. But some troubles don't stay buried just because you stop talking about them." She turned back to Cash. "Yesterday, Martha Hayes came to see me. She told me a McGraw was back, asking questions. She wanted to know if our family would cause problems." "And what did you tell her?" "I told her that the truth doesn't cause problems, lies do. And this town has been living with lies for over a century." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "I also told her that my family has been waiting for a McGraw to come back and ask the right questions." Cash pulled the locket from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. Sarah's composure cracked for the first time, her hand moving to her throat as if she was suddenly struggling to breathe. "Where did you find this?" she whispered. "Hidden in my great-grandfather's desk, along with his journal telling the story of what really happened between them." Sarah picked up the locket with trembling fingers, opening it to reveal Elena's photograph. Tears gathered in her eyes as she studied the image. "I have the same picture," she said softly. "Passed down through our family. Elena's mother gave it to her sisters before." She stopped, composing herself. "Before the night she died. The journal says Jeremiah left to protect her," Cash said, "that he sacrificed everything to keep her safe." "He did," Sarah said, her voice firm again. "But some people couldn't let love alone, even when it was trying to hide. 3 men from town came to the settlement 6 months after Jeremiah left. They said Elena had dishonored their community and needed to be taught a lesson." Cash felt ice forming in his stomach. "What happened?" "My great-great-grandmother was a strong woman, but she was alone. The men who came for her didn't plan on witnesses." Sarah's voice grew harder. "But Elena Crow Feather was not a woman who died quietly. Before they could finish what they started, she managed to send word to Jeremiah." Thomas looked uncomfortable, but Sarah continued relentlessly. "Jeremiah McGraw came back for 1 night only. Not to save Elena, it was too late for that. He came back to make sure the men who killed her paid the price." The room fell silent except for the sound of Jake's crew working in the next room. Cash stared at the locket, understanding finally dawning. His great-grandfather hadn't been running from his responsibilities, he'd been running from the consequences of seeking justice for the woman he loved. "What price?" Cash asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew. Sarah Crow Feather looked him directly in the eye. "The same price Elena paid, blood for blood, as the old laws demanded. 3 men went to kill 1 Comanche woman in 1898. Only 2 came home." Sarah Crow Feather reached into her worn leather purse and withdrew a small beaded pouch. Its colors faded with age, but its craftsmanship still evident. The geometric patterns were worked in traditional Comanche-style blues and whites and deep reds that spoke of ceremonies and sacred purposes. "This belonged to Elena," Sarah said, placing the medicine pouch on the table next to the locket. "She made it herself, filled it with herbs and stones that were important to her spiritual journey. Our people believe such pouches carry the essence of their makers, protecting them and connecting them to their ancestors." Cash stared at the delicate beadwork. Combined with the locket, these artifacts made Elena real in a way that even Jeremiah's passionate journal entries couldn't. She became more than just the object of forbidden love. She became a woman with her own traditions, her own beliefs, her own strength. "Elena gave this to my great-great-grandmother the night before she died," Sarah continued. "She said, if anything happened to her, it should go to the child she carried." The words hit Cash like a physical blow. "Child?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably, but Sarah's gaze remained steady. "Elena was pregnant when those men killed her, Mr. McGraw. She was carrying Jeremiah's baby." Cash felt the room spinning slightly. A child. His great-grandfather and Elena hadn't just been lovers, they'd created a life together. What happened to the baby? Elena's sister took the child and raised him as her own. The boy grew up not knowing who his father was, only that his mother had died protecting a secret that could never be spoken. Sarah's voice grew gentler. "That child was my great-grandfather, which makes you and Thomas distant cousins." Cash looked at Thomas with new eyes. The young man had his grandfather's reserved nature, but Elena's striking features, family, blood family, that Cash had never known existed. "This is why you came here," Cash said, understanding flooding through him. "You've been waiting for someone from my family to come back and learn the truth." "For over a century," Sarah confirmed. "Each generation of our family has carried Elena's story, waiting for the day when it could be told completely, when justice could be spoken aloud instead of whispered in the darkness." Thomas finally spoke, his voice carrying an edge of caution. "Grandmother, telling the story is one thing, but what Mr. McGraw does with it, that's something else entirely." Sarah gave her grandson a look that suggested this was an old disagreement between them. "Thomas thinks some sleeping dogs should be left to lie. He worries that bringing up the past will cause trouble for our family." "And what do you think?" Cash asked. "I think Elena Crowfeather deserves to have her name spoken with honor instead of shame. I think the men who killed her should be remembered for what they were, murderers who escaped justice because of the color of their victim's skin." Sarah's voice grew steel-hard. "And I think Jeremiah McGraw deserves to have his family know he was a man of honor, not the coward this town made him out to be." Cash picked up the medicine pouch, feeling its surprising weight. The beadwork was intricate beyond anything he'd seen, each tiny bead placed with perfect precision. This wasn't just a protective charm, it was a work of art, created by a woman of skill and spiritual depth. "There's more," Sarah said. "Elena left something else behind, something that proves she and Jeremiah were more than just lovers having an affair." She reached into her purse again and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age but still intact. "This is why the men from town couldn't let her live, even after Jeremiah was gone. This is what made her too dangerous to ignore." Cash unfolded the paper carefully. It was written in English, in formal legal language, but the words were clear enough. A marriage certificate, dated the 14th of February 1898, uniting Jeremiah McGraw and Elena Crow. The ceremony had been performed by a traveling minister named Reverend Marcus Clay, with 2 witnesses whose signatures were still legible. "They were married," Cash breathed. "In the eyes of God, if not in the eyes of the law," Sarah confirmed. Texas didn't recognize marriages between white men and native women until well into the next century. But Elena and Jeremiah didn't care about legal recognition, they cared about spiritual union. The implications crashed over Cash like waves. His great-grandfather hadn't just been having an affair, he'd been married to Elena, committed to her in the most sacred way he knew. The child she carried wasn't illegitimate. It was the legitimate heir of both the McGraw ranch fortune and the Crowfeather tribal heritage. The men who killed her, Cash said slowly. They knew about the marriage? They found out about the baby first, Thomas said, speaking with obvious reluctance. Elena was starting to show. In a small town, that kind of news travels fast. Someone figured out the timing, realized Jeremiah was the father. Sarah took up the story. The marriage certificate was found in Elena's belongings after she died. The men who killed her brought it to the town leaders, demanded to know what should be done. Some wanted to destroy it and pretend it never existed. Others wanted to use it to go after Jeremiah legally, challenge his right to his property based on bigamy laws. But Jeremiah came back before they could decide, Cash said. He came back the night after Elena's funeral, Sarah confirmed. My family's oral history is very specific about what happened next. Jeremiah didn't come looking for a fight, he came looking for justice. He wanted to know who had killed his wife and unborn child. Cash stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the land that had once been the center of his great-grandfather's world. Everything he'd believed about Jeremiah was wrong. The man wasn't a deserter or an adulterer, he was a widower seeking justice for his murdered family. Who told him? Cash asked. Elena's youngest sister, Running Deer. She'd seen the men who came that night, recognized 2 of them from town. She told Jeremiah their names. Sarah's voice grew quiet. What happened after that depends on which version of the story you believe. What version does your family believe? Thomas and Sarah exchanged a look before Sarah answered. We believe that justice was served, Mr. McGraw. We believe that Elena's death was answered according to the old laws and that her spirit was finally able to rest. Cash turned back from the window. And the third man, the one who survived, lived the rest of his life knowing what he'd done, Sarah said. Had children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Some of them still live in Black Hollow. Some of them still remember why the McGraw name was never spoken with respect in their families. The medicine pouch felt heavier in Cash's hand as understanding dawned. He wasn't just uncovering a love story from the past, he was reopening wounds that had never properly healed. The descendants of Elena's killers were still here, still living with the secret of what their ancestors had done. Is that why Martha Hayes came to see me? Cash asked. Is her family connected to this? Sarah's silence was answer enough. After Sarah and Thomas left, Cash returned to the secret study with a new sense of purpose. If Jeremiah had hidden the journal and the locket in that room, there might be more evidence of what had really happened in 1898. He began a systematic search, examining every book, every drawer, every potential hiding place. It was behind a loose stone in the fireplace that he found the hand-drawn map. The paper was thick and durable, the kind used for important documents. Unlike the journal entries, this map wasn't in Jeremiah's handwriting. The lines were more delicate, more careful, suggesting Elena's hand. The drawing showed the area around Black Hollow in remarkable detail, marking not just the major landmarks, but also secret places that wouldn't appear on any official survey. A winding path led from the McGraw estate to a spot by the river marked with a small star. Other symbols dotted the map, a crescent moon beside a grove of oak trees, a circle with a cross inside it, near what appeared to be a natural spring, and most intriguingly, a small square marked with the letter E in a location Cash couldn't immediately identify. Jake found him studying the map an hour later, the renovation work temporarily forgotten. That's some detailed surveying work, Jake observed, looking over Cash's shoulder. Hand-drawn, by the looks of it. Someone who knew this land real well. It was Elena's, Cash said. My great-grandfather's wife. Jake's eyebrows rose. Wife? I thought the story was that he ran off to war. Cash filled Jake in on what he'd learned from Sarah Crowfeather, watching the contractor's expression shift from surprise to understanding to something that looked like respect. So he didn't abandon his family, he lost his family, Jake said slowly. That's a hell of a different story. And some folks in town still remember the real version, Cash added. The question is, what do I do with that information? Jake studied the map more carefully. Well, first thing I'd do is see if these locations still exist. This star by the river that looks like it might be the old Comanche settlement Sarah mentioned. And this spring here, I think I know where that is. Used to camp there as a kid. Cash traced the path from his house to the river with his finger. How far would you say this is? 3, maybe 4 miles on horseback. Easy ride, especially if you knew the trails. Jake paused. You thinking of following the map? I'm thinking Elena drew this for a reason. Maybe to show meeting places where she and Jeremiah could be together safely. Or maybe Cash studied the mysterious square marked with E. Maybe to show where something important is buried. That afternoon, Cash and Jake drove to the natural spring marked on Elena's map. Jake's memory proved accurate. The spring was still there, hidden in a grove of ancient oak trees that formed a natural cathedral. Clear water bubbled up from underground, creating a small pool before flowing away toward the river. Pretty spot, Jake observed. Private too. Perfect place for secret meetings. Cash knelt by the spring's edge, imagining Jeremiah and Elena meeting here over a century ago. The water was so clear he could see the bottom, and the oak trees provided shade that would have made even summer afternoons bearable. It wasn't hard to picture them here, a forbidden couple stealing moments together away from the judgment of the world. But it was what Cash found, carved into one of the oak trees, that made the location truly significant. The carving was old, weathered by decades of weather, but still readable. J. M plus E C F, February 1898. Below it, someone had carved a small star, the same symbol used to mark the river location on Elena's map. Valentine's Day, 1898, Cash said, running his fingers over the carved letters, the same date as their marriage certificate. They were married here, Jake realized. This was their wedding spot. Cash studied the tree carving with new understanding. Elena's map wasn't just showing meeting places, it was documenting the most important moments of their relationship. The star by the river was probably where they first met. This spring was where they were married, which meant the mysterious location marked with E was something equally significant. Following Elena's map, they drove toward the location marked with the letter E. The terrain grew rougher as they left the main roads, following dirt tracks that were barely wide enough for Jake's truck. Cash began to worry. They were on a fool's errand. The map was over a century old, and the landscape could have changed dramatically. But Elena's geographical sense proved accurate. The location she'd marked led them to a small hill overlooking the river valley, crowned by a stand of pine trees that had grown tall and straight over the decades. It was a peaceful spot, with a clear view of the surrounding countryside and a feeling of quiet dignity that suggested something important had happened here. They found the grave by accident when Jake stepped on a stone that shifted under his weight. Clearing away pine needles and accumulated soil revealed a carefully constructed burial site, flat stones arranged in a rectangle, with a larger stone at the head that bore a simple carving, E.C.F.M. Beloved, wife, and mother. Elena Crow Feather McGraw. Even in death, she'd been given Jeremiah's name. He buried her here, Cash said, his voice thick with emotion, away from town, where she could rest in peace without judgment. Jake knelt beside the grave, studying the stonework. This is quality work. Someone took time and care with this, someone who loved her. Cash looked around the hilltop with new eyes. The location made sense, high enough to see anyone approaching, surrounded by trees that would provide privacy for grieving, close enough to the McGraw estate that Jeremiah could visit regularly. This wasn't just a burial site, it was a shrine to love that had transcended death. The map has one more location, Jake pointed out, studying Elena's drawing. That circle with the cross, near the spring. Think we should check it out? Cash nodded, but as they prepared to leave Elena's grave, he noticed something that made him pause. The pine trees around the burial site were old, but not old enough to have been here when Elena died. Someone had planted them deliberately, creating a living monument that would grow more beautiful with each passing year. At the spring location marked with the circle and cross, they found what appeared to be the remains of a small structure, stones that might once have formed the foundation of a cabin or shelter. The timbers were long gone, but the stone foundation was still intact, outlining a space about the size of a single room. Hideout, Jake suggested. Maybe, or a place they planned to live together. Cash walked the perimeter of the foundation, imagining the home Jeremiah and Elena had dreamed of building. Look at the view, you can see the estate from here, but you're hidden from the main road. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the foundation stones, Cash felt the full weight of what he'd discovered. Elena's map wasn't just documenting the past, it was revealing the dreams that had died with her. The spring where they'd married, the hill where she was buried, and this foundation where they'd planned to build their future together. But the map also raised new questions. If Jeremiah had taken such care with Elena's burial, if he'd planned a future with her, why had he never returned after seeking justice for her death? What had happened on that night in 1898 that had made coming home impossible? And most troubling of all, if some people in Black Hollow still remembered what their ancestors had done, how far would they go to keep those secrets buried? That evening, as Jake's crew finished cleaning up from another day of restoration work, Cash found himself drawn back to the basement, a space they'd barely explored during the renovation. The house's foundation was solid stone, typical of 1892 construction, but something about the way the walls were laid nagged at him. Elena's map had shown him that nothing in this story was quite what it seemed, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself held more secrets. It was while examining the stone foundation that Cash noticed the irregularity. One section of the basement wall, about 6 feet long, was built with stones that didn't quite match the rest. The mortar was different, too newer, though still decades old. Someone had rebuilt part of this wall, carefully, but not perfectly. Cash fetched a crowbar from Jake's tools and began working at the mortar. It was harder than he'd expected, but not impossible. As the stones loosened, he caught a glimpse of something behind them, fabric, wrapped around what appeared to be a long, narrow object. With growing excitement and dread, Cash carefully removed enough stones to extract the hidden bundle. The fabric was oiled canvas, military grade, designed to protect whatever lay inside from moisture and decay. His hands trembled as he unwrapped it, revealing an object that made his blood run cold. A cavalry saber, its blade still stained with what could only be dried blood. The weapon was beautiful in the way that tools of death could be beautiful, perfectly balanced, expertly crafted, with an ornate hilt that spoke of an officer's rank and status. But it was the blood on the blade that made Cash's stomach turn. Even after more than a century, the dark stains were unmistakable. Wrapped with the saber was a piece of paper, folded and refolded so many times it was nearly falling apart. Cash opened it carefully, recognizing Jeremiah's handwriting immediately. But this wasn't like the measured, thoughtful prose of the journal upstairs. This writing was urgent, desperate, the work of a man writing against time. Asterisk. If this record is ever found, let it be known that I, Jeremiah McGraw, did, on the night of September 15th, 1898, take the life of Edmund Hayes in fair combat. Hayes was one of 3 men who murdered my wife Elena and our unborn child 6 months prior. He faced me with his own blade, and though he was a skilled fighter, God's justice prevailed. I make no apology for this action and claim no regret, save that I could not save Elena's life as easily as I took her killer's. Asterisk. Cash had to read the passage twice before its full meaning sank in. Edmund Hayes. Martha Hayes had warned him about stirring up old troubles, but she hadn't mentioned that her own ancestor was one of Elena's killers. No wonder she'd seemed nervous when she visited. She knew exactly what secrets the McGraw estate might reveal. The confession continued. Hayes came alone to meet me at the old mill, thinking perhaps that grief had made me weak, or that his skill with a blade would be sufficient to silence the last witness to his crime. He was wrong on both counts, but as he lay dying, he spoke words that have haunted me since. Kill me if you must, but you'll never touch the others. They have protection you can't imagine, and they know you're coming. Asterisk. Cash felt ice forming in his stomach as he read on. Asterisk. I had believed that Elena's death was the work of individual hatred, the actions of three men who could not accept love between our peoples. Hayes's dying words revealed a darker truth, that Elena's murder was planned and sanctioned by men of power in Black Hollow, men who saw our marriage as a threat to the natural order they were sworn to protect. I am no longer hunting three murderers. I am standing against an entire system that views people like my Elena as less than human. Asterisk. The implications crashed over Cash like cold water. This wasn't a story about forbidden love destroyed by individual prejudice. This was about institutional racism, about powerful men who had conspired to commit murder and then covered it up. Elena hadn't been killed by a few drunk cowboys. She'd been executed by order of Black Hollow's leadership. Asterisk, I have made my choice. Hayes was the weakest of the three, the one most likely to face me in honest combat. The other two, Samuel Peters and William Morrison, are protected by their positions in the community. Peters sits on the town council and has the backing of every businessman in Black Hollow. Morrison wears a deputy's badge and has the law on his side. To pursue them would require an army, not a single man with a sword. Asterisk. Cash recognized the names. Peters Avenue ran through the heart of downtown Black Hollow, and the Morrison family still owned the largest bank in the county. These weren't random killers. They were the founding families of the town, men whose descendants still held power and influence. Asterisk. Therefore I will be known as the man who killed Edmund Hayes and fled like a coward rather than face justice. This lie I can live with. What I cannot live with is allowing Peters and Morrison to believe they are safe from all consequences. They will spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, wondering when Jeremiah McGraw might return to collect the debt they owe. This uncertainty, this fear, is the only justice Elena will receive from this world. I pray it will be enough for the next. Asterisk. The final lines were written in a different hand, shakier, as if Jeremiah had been injured or exhausted. Asterisk. To whoever finds this record, I have failed to protect the woman I loved, failed to achieve the justice she deserved, failed to be the husband and father she needed. But I have not failed to remember. Elena Crow Feather McGraw was the finest person I have ever known, and her murder was the greatest crime this town has ever committed. If you are a McGraw reading this, know that your blood carries the burden of that loss. If you are not, know that some debts pass from generation to generation until they are finally paid. Asterisk. Cash sat back on his heels, the blood-stained saber across his knees, trying to process what he'd learned. Jeremiah hadn't fled because he was a coward. He'd fled because he was outnumbered and outgunned, facing not just individual killers, but an entire power structure built on the assumption that some lives mattered less than others. But he'd also left a message for future generations. The saber wasn't just evidence of what had happened, it was a challenge, a reminder that justice delayed wasn't necessarily justice denied. The sound of footsteps on the basement stairs made Cash look up. Jake appeared, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing an expression of concern. "Thought you might need this," Jake said, then stopped when he saw the saber. "Jesus Christ. What is that?" "Justice," Cash said quietly, then corrected himself. "Or maybe just revenge. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference." Jake descended the remaining steps slowly, his eyes fixed on the blood-stained blade. "That's from the night he killed Hayes, isn't it?" Cash nodded, handing over Jeremiah's final confession. Jake read it in silence, his expression growing grimmer with each line. "So Edmund Hayes was Martha's ancestor," Jake said finally. "That explains why she was so nervous about you being here." "It explains more than that," Cash replied. "It explains why this town has spent over a century making sure the real story never came out. The founding families built their reputations on a lie. If the truth about Elena's murder became common knowledge, it would destroy a lot of carefully constructed legacies," Jake finished. "Peters Avenue, Morrison Bank, Hayes Historical Society. Half the town's landmarks are named after murderers." Cash stood up, the saber still in his hands. The weapon was heavier than he'd expected, but perfectly balanced. A tool made for killing, wielded by a man who'd had no choice but to use it. "The question is," Cash said, "what do I do with this information? Jeremiah couldn't get justice for Elena because he was one man against an entire system. But things have changed. The law isn't owned by the same families anymore." "You thinking about going public with this?" Jake asked. Cash looked at the blood-stained blade, thinking about Elena's grave on the hilltop and the medicine pouch Sarah Crowfeather had shown him. 3 generations of her family had carried the truth about Elena's death, waiting for someone with the power to act on it. "I'm thinking Elena Crowfeather McGraw deserves to have her real story told," Cash said finally, "and I'm thinking the men who killed her should be remembered for what they really were." But even as he said it, Cash knew that revealing the truth would mean going to war with the most powerful families in Black Hollow. Families who had spent over a century building their reputations on the foundation of Elena's silent story. It was a war Jeremiah McGraw had been too outnumbered to fight. But Cash McGraw had advantages his great-grandfather had never possessed: money, influence, and allies who were no longer afraid to speak the truth. The question was whether those advantages would be enough to finally get justice for a woman who had been dead for over a century, and whether Cash was prepared for the consequences of challenging secrets that some people would kill to protect. Cash spent the next 3 days studying every detail of Jeremiah's confession and researching the descendants of the men named in it. What he found confirmed his worst suspicions. The Hayes, Peters, and Morrison families had indeed built Black Hollow's power structure on the foundation of Elena's covered-up murder. Martha Hayes wasn't just the town historian, she was the chairwoman of the city council and the driving force behind Black Hollow's tourism board. The Peters family owned the largest ranch in the county and had produced 2 state legislators. The Morrisons controlled not just the bank, but also the newspaper and the radio station. Between the 3 families, they essentially owned the town. But Cash also discovered something that gave him hope. Hidden in Jeremiah's study, behind books that hadn't been moved in over a century, was a marriage certificate, not the copy Sarah Crowfeather had shown him, but the original, signed by Reverend Marcus Clay and witnessed by 2 men whose signatures were still clear. More importantly, it was registered with the county clerk in Marshall, filed properly according to the laws of 1898. Under Texas law, Elena Crowfeather McGraw had been Jeremiah's legal wife, regardless of what social conventions might have dictated. Their unborn child would have been the legitimate heir to the McGraw estate. The marriage that the town's founders had viewed as an abomination was, in the eyes of the law, perfectly valid. Jake found Cash in the study that evening, surrounded by legal documents and newspaper clippings from 1898. "You look like a man planning for war," Jake observed. "Maybe I am," Cash replied. "Jake, what would you do if you discovered your family had been carrying shame for over a century based on lies?" Jake settled into the chair across from Cash's desk. "I'd want to set the record straight, but I'd also want to be damn sure I was ready for the fight that would bring." "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Cash gestured to the papers spread across the desk. "I've got proof that Elena was murdered, proof that her killers were never prosecuted, proof that this town built its reputation on covering up those crimes." The question is whether revealing that truth will actually accomplish anything or just destroy a lot of lives that had nothing to do with what happened in 1898. What does Sarah Crowfeather think? I called her this morning. She wants the truth told, but she's also worried about backlash against her family. Thomas is even more cautious, he thinks. Stirring up old hatred will just create new problems. Jake was quiet for a moment, studying the marriage certificate. You know what I think? I think this isn't really about what happened in 1898. This is about what kind of man you want to be in 2025. Before Cash could respond, they heard vehicles pulling into the driveway. Through the window, Cash watched 3 cars park in front of the house: Martha Hayes's sedan, a black pickup truck, and a sheriff's department cruiser. This wasn't a social visit. Looks like word got out about what you've been researching, Jake said grimly. They met the delegation on the front porch. Martha Hayes led the group, flanked by 2 men Cash recognized from his research. Harold Peters, a heavy-set man in his 60s who ran the family ranch, and Deputy Sheriff Tim Morrison, a young man who wore his uniform with the casual authority of someone born to power. Behind them stood Sheriff Carl Brennan, an older man whose weathered face suggested he'd seen enough of life to be tired of most of it. "Mr. McGraw," Martha said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "About what?" Cash asked, though he already knew. "About the stories you've been telling around town," Harold Peters said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. "About wild accusations against upstanding families based on old papers that could say anything." Cash felt Jake tense beside him, ready to back whatever play Cash decided to make. "I haven't made any accusations, Mr. Peters. I've just been researching my family's history." "Researching with the Crowfeather family," Deputy Morrison added. "Stirring up old grievances that decent people put behind them generations ago." Sheriff Brennan stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. "Mr. McGraw, I'm here in an official capacity. There've been complaints about trespassing on private property, disturbing grave sites, and making threats against prominent citizens." "What threats?" Cash asked. "The kind that come from carrying around bloody weapons and making claims about century-old murders," Peters said. "The kind that suggest you might be planning to finish what your crazy ancestor started." Cash felt his temper rising but kept his voice level. "My ancestor wasn't crazy, Mr. Peters. He was a man seeking justice for his murdered wife." "Your ancestor was a killer and a coward," Martha Hayes said, her composure finally cracking. "He murdered Edmund Hayes in cold blood and then ran away rather than face the consequences." "Is that the story your family tells?" Cash asked. "Because I've read a different version, one that suggests Edmund Hayes got exactly what he deserved." The tension on the porch ratcheted up several notches. Deputy Morrison's hand moved closer to his weapon, and Sheriff Brennan stepped between Cash and the others. "That's enough," Brennan said firmly. "Mr. McGraw, I'm going to ask you to come with me for questioning. Voluntarily, for now." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that 3 respected families in this town are feeling threatened by a wealthy outsider who's been digging up old stories and waving around antique weapons," Brennan replied. "Now, we can do this easy or we can do it hard, but we are going to do it." Cash looked at Jake, who gave an almost imperceptible nod toward the house. The artifacts, Jeremiah's journal, Elena's marriage certificate, the blood-stained saber, were all inside, unprotected. If Cash left with the sheriff, there was no guarantee they'd still be there when he returned. "I'll come voluntarily," Cash said, "but I want to secure my property first. Jake, make sure everything valuable is locked up safe." Jake understood immediately. "Yes, sir, I'll take care of everything." As Cash followed Sheriff Brennan to the patrol car, he heard Martha Hayes's voice behind him. "This family has brought nothing but trouble to Black Hollow for over a century. Maybe it's time that trouble was permanently resolved." The ride to the sheriff's office was conducted in silence, but Cash's mind was racing. The delegation's visit had confirmed what he'd suspected. The descendants of Elena's killers knew exactly what secrets the McGraw estate contained, and they were prepared to use legal pressure to keep those secrets buried. But they'd also made a crucial mistake. By threatening him openly, they'd revealed how much they feared the truth coming out. Men, confident in their family legacies, didn't send armed deputies to intimidate someone researching genealogy. They sent lawyers to silence someone who possessed evidence of their ancestors' crimes. At the sheriff's office, Cash was shown to an interrogation room where Sheriff Brennan offered him coffee and a surprisingly understanding smile. "Mr. McGraw, I'm going to be straight with you," Brennan said. "I've been sheriff in this county for 23 years. I've heard all the old stories, including some versions that don't get told in polite company. What you're stirring up, it's bigger than just family history." "How big?" "Big enough that some very powerful people are very worried about what you might do with what you've found." Brennan leaned back in his chair. "Now, I took an oath to uphold the law, and that includes protecting citizens from harassment and threats. But I also swore to serve justice, and sometimes those two things don't line up as neatly as they should." Cash studied the sheriff's weathered face, looking for clues about which way this conversation was heading. "What are you saying, Sheriff?" "I'm saying that if you've got evidence of crimes, real evidence, not just family stories, then you have a right and maybe a responsibility to bring that evidence forward. But I'm also saying that doing so is going to cost you, and it's going to cost other people too. Innocent people who had nothing to do with what happened in 1898. Brennan pulled out a manila folder and placed it on the table between them. "These are the official reports from September 1898. Edmund Hayes was found dead at the old mill, killed by sword wounds. No arrests were made, no suspects identified. Case closed and filed away." Cash opened the folder and read the brief reports. They were exactly what he'd expected, perfunctory investigations that asked no real questions and pursued no real leads. Justice administered by the same men who'd ordered Elena's death. "There's also this," Brennan said, producing a second document. "A coroner's report on an unidentified Native American woman found dead by the river in March 1898. Cause of death listed as accidental drowning. Elena's death, officially recorded as an accident." Cash felt his anger rising again, but Brennan continued before he could speak. "Now, if someone were to present new evidence about those deaths, evidence that suggested they weren't random or accidental, that would require reopening both investigations. That would mean asking a lot of questions that some people have spent a lot of money making sure never got asked." Cash looked up from the reports. "And if someone were to do that?" Sheriff Brennan smiled grimly. "Then that someone had better be prepared for the fight of his life. Because the people who've been keeping those secrets buried aren't going to give up without using every bit of power and influence they've spent over a century accumulating." "What would you do, Sheriff?" "If you were in my position?" Brennan was quiet for a long moment. "I'd ask myself whether justice delayed for over a century is still justice, and I'd ask myself whether I was strong enough to see it through to the end, regardless of the cost." He stood up and moved toward the door. "You're free to go, Mr. McGraw, for now, but I'd suggest you think very carefully about your next moves, because once you take this public, there's no going back." As Cash left the sheriff's office, he found Jake waiting in the parking lot with the truck running and a grim expression on his face. "We've got problems," Jake said as soon as Cash climbed in. "While you were in there, someone broke into the house." The McGraw estate looked undisturbed from the outside, but Jake's trained eye caught the details that mattered. A window that had been carefully pried open and then closed, footprints in the soft earth around the foundation that hadn't been there that morning, and most telling of all, the front door standing slightly ajar despite being locked when they'd left. "They were professional about it," Jake said as they approached the house, "knew what they were looking for and where to find it. Inside, the damage was surgical, rather than destructive. Whoever had broken in hadn't ransacked the place like common burglars. They'd conducted a methodical search, going straight to the locations most likely to contain the evidence Cash had been gathering. The secret study had been thoroughly searched, every book examined, every drawer emptied. Jeremiah's desk showed signs of being carefully disassembled and reassembled. But they'd missed the most important hiding place. "The basement," Cash said, taking the stairs two at a time with Jake close behind. The loose stones had been moved and replaced, but not quite in their original positions. The hiding place had been found and searched. Cash's heart sank as he pried the stones loose again, expecting to find the space empty. Instead, he found something that stopped him cold. A tribal peace pipe, its bowl carved from red stone, and its stem decorated with eagle feathers and beadwork that matched Elena's medicine pouch. Wrapped around the stem was a note in Sarah Crow Feather's careful handwriting. Asterisk. "Mr. McGraw, Thomas and I saw the cars at your house and knew trouble was coming. We took the liberty of retrieving certain items for safekeeping before they could be stolen or destroyed. The peace pipe belonged to Elena's grandmother and has been waiting over a century to serve its purpose. When you're ready to tell the truth publicly, light the pipe and my family will stand with you. We've been silent long enough. Sarah asterisk." Cash unwrapped the peace pipe carefully, feeling its weight and significance. This wasn't just another artifact, it was a declaration of alliance, a symbol that the truth would finally be spoken regardless of the consequences. Jake examined the note over Cash's shoulder. Smart woman. She knew they'd come for the evidence. "The question is what they found before she got here," Cash said, climbing back up to the study. A more careful examination revealed the scope of the theft. The marriage certificate was gone, along with several pages from Jeremiah's journal that contained the most damning accusations against the Hayes, Peters, and Morrison families. The blood-stained saber had been taken, along with most of the supporting documentation that proved Elena's murder was planned rather than spontaneous. But the thieves had made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that the most important evidence would be hidden in the most obvious place. They'd searched the study and the basement thoroughly, but they'd ignored the plain sight hiding spot that had protected Elena's locket for over a century. The tintype photograph of Jeremiah in his military uniform was still on the side table where Cash had found it days earlier. And tucked behind it, exactly where it had always been, was the most important document of all, the original copy of Jeremiah's final confession, the one that named Elena's killers and described the power structure that had protected them. "They got the marriage certificate and the saber," Cash told Jake. "But they didn't get this." Jake read the confession with growing amazement. "This is dynamite. Jeremiah didn't just name the killers, he laid out the entire conspiracy. And now I have to decide what to do with it." Cash studied the tribal peace pipe, thinking about Sarah's message. "If I go public with this, I'm not just accusing 3 dead men of murder, I'm accusing their families of spending over a century covering it up. Which they just proved by breaking in here and stealing evidence," Jake pointed out. "You think that was coincidence? They take you in for questioning while someone just happens to burgle your house?" Cash's phone buzzed with an incoming text message from an unknown number. Asterisk. "You have 24 hours to leave Black Hollow permanently. Take your lies and your troublemaking with you. This is the only warning you'll receive." Asterisk. "They're not exactly being subtle about it," Cash said, showing Jake the message. "Good. Means they're scared. Scared people make mistakes." Jake looked around the ransacked study. "Question is, what's your next move?" Cash thought about Sheriff Brennan's words about justice delayed versus justice denied. He thought about Elena's grave on the hilltop and the dreams that had died with her. He thought about Sarah Crow Feather's family, who had carried the truth for over a century while waiting for someone with the power to act on it. Most of all, he thought about Jeremiah's final words. Asterisk. "Some debts pass from generation to generation until they are finally paid." Asterisk. Number 2. My next move is to call a town meeting, Cash said finally. It's time Black Hollow heard the real story about what happened in 1898. Jake whistled low. You sure about that? These people just proved they're willing to break the law to keep their secrets. What makes you think they'll let you speak publicly? Cash picked up the tribal peace pipe, feeling the smooth stone and the soft touch of eagle feathers. Because Sarah Crowfeather is right, we've all been silent long enough. And because some truths are bigger than the people who try to suppress them. He pulled out his phone and called the number for Black Hollow's City Hall. When the receptionist answered, Cash identified himself and made a simple request. He wanted to address the next city council meeting about a matter of historical importance to the community. What kind of historical matter? The receptionist asked. The kind that's been waiting over a century to be told, Cash replied. The kind that affects every family in Black Hollow, whether they know it or not. The Black Hollow Community Center hadn't seen a crowd like this in decades. Word had spread quickly through the small town that Cash McGraw planned to make a public statement about his family's history, and curiosity had drawn nearly 200 people to the meeting. They filled every chair and lined the walls, creating an atmosphere that crackled with tension and anticipation. Martha Hayes sat in the front row with Harold Peters and Deputy Tim Morrison flanking her like bodyguards. Their faces were masks of controlled anger, but Cash could see the worry in their eyes. Behind them, scattered throughout the crowd, were faces Cash recognized from his research, descendants of the founding families who had built their reputations on buried secrets. But not everyone in the room was there to oppose him. Sarah and Thomas Crowfeather entered just as Cash was setting up his presentation materials, carrying themselves with the quiet dignity of people who had waited over a century for this moment. They chose seats near the middle of the room, where their presence would be visible to everyone, but not confrontational. Sheriff Brennan stood near the back, his expression unreadable, but his position strategic, close enough to the exits to control the crowd if things got ugly. Jake Sullivan sat near the front, ready to provide backup if Cash needed it. Cash had spent hours deciding how to present Elena's story. He could have started with legal documents and historical evidence, building a careful case like a lawyer arguing before a jury. Instead, he chose to begin with the truth that had taken him the longest to understand. "My name is Cash McGraw," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "For 68 years, I've carried shame about my great-grandfather, believing he was a man who abandoned his family for the glory of war. Tonight, I want to tell you the real story of Jeremiah McGraw and why he left Black Hollow in 1898. He placed Elena's photograph on the display easel, enlarged so everyone in the room could see her face clearly. The murmur that went through the crowd told Cash that some people recognized her, even after all these years. "This is Elena Crowfeather McGraw," Cash continued. "She was my great-grandfather's wife, legally married in February 1898. She was also a member of the Comanche Nation, who lived peacefully by the river until she was murdered in March of that year." Martha Hayes started to stand, but Harold Peters placed a restraining hand on her arm. They'd apparently decided to let Cash hang himself with his own words rather than create a scene that might lend credibility to his accusations. Cash pulled out the memorial stone he'd commissioned, a simple granite marker engraved with Elena's name and the dates of her birth and death. He set it on the table where everyone could see it. "Elena Crowfeather McGraw died on March 15th, 1898, Cash said. "The official record lists her death as accidental drowning. The real story is that she was murdered by 3 men from this town who couldn't accept that a white rancher had married a Native American woman." Now the murmurs turned to angry whispers. Cash saw several people look toward Martha Hayes and the others in the front row, their expressions ranging from confusion to dawning understanding. Sarah Crowfeather stood up, her movement drawing every eye in the room. "Mr. McGraw speaks the truth," she said, her voice carrying the authority of her years and her heritage. "Elena Crowfeather was my great-great-grandmother. For over a century, my family has carried the story of her murder and the cowardice of those who covered it up. Thomas joined his grandmother, holding a folder of documents. We have witnesses' accounts, passed down through our oral tradition. We have names, dates, and details that have never been officially recorded, because no one with power cared about the death of a native woman. Cash felt the momentum in the room shifting. What had started as one man's accusation was becoming a shared revelation, supported by a family that had preserved the truth through 5 generations. The 3 men who killed Elena were Edmund Hayes, Samuel Peters, and William Morrison. Cash continued, watching as descendants of those families shifted uncomfortably in their seats. 6 months later, my great-grandfather returned to Black Hollow and challenged Edmund Hayes to single combat. Hayes died that night, but the other 2 killers were protected by their positions in the community. He held up Jeremiah's confession, the document that had survived the break-in. This is my great-grandfather's own account of what happened. He didn't flee because he was a coward. He fled because he was one man fighting an entire system designed to protect white murderers and silence native voices. Martha Hayes finally found her voice. "This is outrageous," she said, standing despite Peters's attempts to keep her seated. "You can't come into our community and make wild accusations based on old papers and family stories." "I'm not making accusations," Cash replied calmly. "I'm revealing truth that's been buried for over a century, truth that some people in this room have spent their entire lives trying to keep hidden." Sheriff Brennan stepped forward from his position near the wall. "Mr. McGraw, do you have evidence to support these claims? Legal evidence that would stand up in a court of law?" Cash looked at the memorial stone, thinking about Elena's grave on the hilltop and the love that had transcended death. "I have enough evidence to reopen the investigation into Elena's death, Sheriff. I have enough evidence to prove that this community built its foundation on murder and covered up the crime for over a century." He turned back to the crowd, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "But more than that, I have the right to honor my great-grandfather's memory and to tell Elena's story with the respect she deserved. Some truths are more important than the comfort of the people who benefit from keeping them buried." The room erupted into chaos as people began shouting questions and accusations. But through it all, Cash saw Sarah Crowfeather's steady gaze, and he knew that after more than a century of silence, Elena's voice was finally being heard. 6 months after the town meeting that changed everything, Cash McGraw stood in the restored parlor of his great-grandfather's house, watching the morning sun stream through windows that had been dark for over a century. The McGraw estate had been transformed, but not in the way he'd originally planned. Instead of a private residence, the house had become the Elena Crow Feather McGraw Cultural Center, a place where the real history of Black Hollow could be told without the filters of shame or political convenience. School children came regularly to learn about the complex heritage of their community, and visitors from across Texas came to see what happened when a town finally faced its buried past. The centerpiece of the center was a restored family Bible, its leather binding carefully repaired and its pages protected behind glass. But it wasn't the Bible itself that drew visitors, it was what Cash had discovered inside. Pressed between the pages of Genesis, Jeremiah had preserved wildflowers from Elena's wedding bouquet, along with a family tree that showed both the McGraw lineage and Elena's Crowfeather heritage, united by marriage and loss. Thomas Crowfeather appeared in the doorway, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the easy smile of someone who'd found his place in the world. At 26, he'd become the center's cultural director, teaching traditional Comanche crafts and stories alongside the documented history of his and Cash's shared family. "The school group from Marshall just pulled up," Thomas said. 23 kids, ages 8 to 12. "You ready for the tough questions?" Cash chuckled. Children asked the hardest questions because they hadn't yet learned which topics were supposed to be uncomfortable. Last week, a 10-year-old girl had asked why it took over 100 years for adults to start telling the truth about Elena's death. Cash was still working on a good answer to that one. "I'm ready," Cash said. "Is your grandmother coming today? Wouldn't miss it. She's bringing her newest project, a traditional wedding dress made in the style Elena would have worn. She says, every bride deserves to be remembered in beauty, not just in sorrow." Sarah Crowfeather, now 80, had become the center's spiritual heart. Her presence lent authenticity to everything they did, and her stories brought Elena to life in ways that documents alone never could. She'd also become something Cash had never expected to have at his age: family. Not just distant family connected by century-old tragedy, but real family who shared meals and holidays and the comfortable arguments that came with genuine affection. The transformation of Black Hollow hadn't been easy or quick. The revelation about Elena's murder had split the community along lines that reflected deeper attitudes about history, accountability, and justice. Some families, embarrassed by their ancestors' crimes, had left town entirely. Others had embraced the opportunity to build something better on a foundation of truth rather than lies. Martha Hayes had surprised everyone by becoming one of the center's most dedicated volunteers. The discovery that her great-great-grandfather had been a murderer had devastated her initially, but ultimately freed her from the burden of defending a legacy that had never been worthy of defense. She now led tours that specifically addressed how historical lies had shaped the community's development, and her courage in facing uncomfortable truths had inspired others to do the same. The Peters and Morrison families had been less gracious about the revelations. Harold Peters had sold his ranch and moved to Oklahoma, while the Morrisons had closed their bank and relocated the family business to Dallas. Their departure had created economic challenges for Black Hollow, but it had also created space for new leadership that was more interested in building a sustainable future than protecting an unsustainable past. Sheriff Brennan had quietly reopened the investigations into both Elena's murder and Edmund Hayes's death, officially documenting what everyone now knew to be true. The cases would never go to trial. All the principal actors had been dead for decades, but the historical record was finally complete and accurate. Jake Sullivan's crew had finished the restoration work months ago, but Jake himself had stayed on as the center's maintenance supervisor. He claimed it was because he wanted to see the project through to completion, but Cash suspected it had more to do with Jake's growing friendship with Martha Hayes. Some relationships, it seemed, could bloom even in soil that had been poisoned by old secrets. The school children filed into the parlor with the barely controlled energy of young people on a field trip. Their teacher, a young woman named Rebecca Torres, who'd grown up hearing whispered stories about the McGraw curse, settled them in a circle around the fireplace where Cash and Thomas waited. "Good morning," Cash said, his voice carrying the same warmth he'd once used to gentle, frightened horses. "I'm Cash McGraw, and this is my cousin Thomas Crowfeather. We want to tell you a story about our great-great-grandparents and what happened when they fell in love, in a time and place where their love wasn't allowed." As he began Elena's story, Cash's eyes moved to the portrait above the mantelpiece, not the formal oil painting of Jeremiah that had been there originally, but a new painting commissioned from a Comanche artist. It showed Jeremiah and Elena together, standing by the natural spring where they'd been married, their hands clasped, and their faces reflecting the joy and hope that had sustained them through impossible circumstances. The portrait had been painted from descriptions in Jeremiah's journal and Elena's family stories, but somehow the artist had captured something beyond mere physical appearance. The love between them was visible, but so was the strength that had allowed them to face hatred with dignity and death with honor. A small boy in the front row raised his hand. "Mr. McGraw, why did it take so long for people to tell Elena's real story?" Cash looked at the restored family Bible, thinking about the wildflowers Jeremiah had preserved between its pages and the family tree that showed how love could survive even murder and lies. Because sometimes, young man, people are so afraid of being uncomfortable that they choose to stay confused instead. But Elena and Jeremiah's story teaches us that some truths are worth the discomfort of facing them. He paused, looking around the circle of young faces that represented Black Hollow's future. The most important thing you can learn from their story is that love is stronger than hate, truth is stronger than lies, and courage is stronger than fear. Those lessons are worth waiting for, no matter how long it takes. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees that surrounded the estate, carrying with it the sense of spring and the promise of new growth in soil that had finally been cleared of old poison. And in the parlor, where secrets had once been buried, children learned that some stories are worth telling, regardless of how much time has passed or how much courage they require.